Hello and welcome back to Underlab. Recently I've been under a lot of pressure working on various projects, so I don't have the time to make one of my longer animated videos. Still, I thought this would be a good opportunity to talk about one of the bigger issues surrounding Undertale. Recently I've seen a lot of videos and comments remarking that Undertale has become oversaturated and that there's been too much of a good thing. So to cut a long story short, is that true? Is there really too much Undertale? Well, kind of obviously yes. There's hundreds of fan games, loads of art and comics, there's merchandise, and then there's rip-off merchandise, and there's even YouTube channels dedicated to the game. There's even rip-offs of the YouTube channels, which is how you know you've gone too far down the rabbit hole. Of course, I don't really see why that's a problem. If you're sick of Undertale, then all you need to do is simply avoid Undertale, surely. A lot of people have been acting as if the game is now ruined and that it wasn't as good as they thought it was at the time. Is Undertale necessarily the 10 out of 10 masterpiece that many reviewers said it was? Well, maybe, maybe not. A lot of people's perception of the game was ruined by people overpraising it and acting as if it was something it isn't. Clearly it's one of my favourite games, but even I can acknowledge its flaws, such as the occasional plot hole in the story, glitches within the game's code, and how forced the morality aspect of the game is. There's a reason why Undertale became Game of the Year 2015, and it's not because of some collective hysteria we all experienced that made us think the game was a lot better than it really was. Undertale is simply a great example of an RPG that came out at exactly the right time. Let me explain why. When I say indie game, what comes to mind? For me, I think of the likes of Super Meat Boy, Fez, Braid and Minecraft. I also think of the many survival and early access games that have been appearing on Steam as of the past few years. Notice the one similarity between all of these games. They're not traditional RPGs, and while some of them do have an underlying story, it isn't the focus of those games. Undertale isn't the only indie game to have emphasis placed on its narrative in the past decade, but it's still in the minority. Most indie games these days seem to be heavily focused on gimmicks. Take Goat Simulator for example. People buy that game because it's wacky and silly, and while they're quite within their rights to enjoy it, it succeeds by having a complete lack of sense. Undertale is the opposite, as it's a game that depends entirely on you being invested in the story it is trying to tell, as otherwise it would fall apart. You could even say that about one of my favourite indie games ever made, Terraria. While it's undeniably a great RPG, the emphasis is on the combat and mining and building mechanics. Nowhere in Terraria is there much of a story to be found. Now, having a story doesn't by default make a game brilliant. What's important about Undertale having such a clearly defined narrative is that it's simply something not many indie games are doing at the moment. It was refreshing for a lot of us to experience a story full of emotional highs and lows in the form of a retro-style video game. It's a specific combination of innovation and nostalgia that makes it rather unique. And after all, that tends to be what makes an indie game good. It's pretty much impossible to make something truly original these days. However, it is still possible to combine ideas into something that feels new. That's why Minecraft is so successful despite its similarities to games like Roblox, and Terraria is so successful despite its similarity to Minecraft. By switching from 3D to 2D, and adding lots of content Minecraft doesn't have, Terraria distinguished itself as a great independent game. While there's many games with good stories, many games with amazing music, and there's many bullet hell games and RPGs out there, Undertale may be the only one that's all of these things, and it's a combination that works well. Does that make for the perfect game? No, of course not. Nothing is perfect. However, Undertale is good enough to be a justifiable 10 out of 10 in the eyes of many people, myself included. Naturally, the more you think about it, the more you'll see it for its flaws. That isn't the game becoming worse over time, it just means we're picking up on minor details that we never saw before. If they weren't important enough to ruin the game the first time, then why should we let them the second time? Undertale hasn't changed, rather the people talking about it have. I have the most justification of anyone to be sick of Undertale, so to speak, seeing how I've made mostly Undertale videos for the past few months. I guess Toby Fox could be worse off, but to tell you the truth, I'm not. While it is quite tedious to keep coming back to the same thing, I really do admire the game from a creative standpoint, and I find it quite enjoyable to pick up on all the minor details that, when added together, make for a great game. If even I can still appreciate it, I'm not sure why there's so many other people out there having what appears to be a mental breakdown over a video game. It's only natural to grow sick of something you're overexposed to, and I don't blame anyone for feeling that there's too much Undertale out there. However, if you feel like that, then it's just time to move on to something else. Those of us who still enjoy talking about Undertale should be allowed to do so. I hate the stigma that Undertale has attached to it. Because it's a small self-contained story-based RPG, people seem to think that its shelf life is extremely limited. Apparently, we're only allowed to keep enjoying games with constant updates, or games that aren't dependent on their stories, according to some YouTubers and commenters. I know that's not exactly what they say, but but by claiming Undertale is irrelevant a year and a bit on, that's essentially what's being insinuated. I want to keep talking about Undertale, amongst other things, for as long as it interests me and my subscribers, and so I'm just going to keep doing that. To the rest of you making some grand statement about how Undertale is all over now, and it's time for us losers to pack up our bags and move on, well, you can stick to enjoying your cruddy early access games that just came out on Steam and barely work. Strangely enough, I think I'd rather stick with Undertale.